of times people confuse our work with what is often referred to as post-industrial transformations. So people talk to us about like the High Line, or they talk to us about Duisburg Nord. What we're very interested in is active industrial systems in cities.
We find that these are landscapes that are just really not often designed. These are sites that have extreme capacity to do things that you can't do in other places, and that's what we became really interested in, like this kind of immense density that occurs on an industrial landscape where global systems are conflating with some kind of local condition.
We ask a lot sort of what makes a city interesting. We're talking about walking through the streets and smelling chocolate because there's a chocolate factory there. That actually becomes a new type of urban program, a new type of urban phenomenon. It also raises certain complexities, especially as you scale up. That becomes, to us, just sort of a fascinating grounds for a generative form. And so I think our typical model is, as opposed to sort of seeking isolation, almost like a convenient separation of things that are dissimilar, how do we actually interweave these things as densely as possible?
There's usually actually no central figure for a designer to work in them, but it's usually a series of discrete engineering projects or something, and there's no one that kind of speaks between all of these things or looks for productive moments of overlap between them. So that's where we see there is quite a bit of opportunity to intervene. There are just different things that can happen at these places. I mean, we think it's just a lot more exciting to be playing basketball as an oil tanker passes by within feet. That's kind of the moments that we're trying to cultivate in the work.
Yeah, we often, there's a sort of a reference Koolhaas, very famous, with his sort of eating oysters on the nth floor with boxing gloves on, naked, and like that's what the city tries to create, right? The city's trying to create these sort of dynamic interrelationships. I think we're always in sort of search of that kind of new urban phenomenon. You get sort of bored seeing the same type of architecture, the same type of urban environments. This project for us is sort of an ongoing project that we're undertaking at our office to sort of catalog the different projects that we've been working on for the recent years. There's essentially sort of two types of compression that we're working on in the model. One is sort of a system of time, and one is a sort of a compression in space. We work with fairly large sort of industrial sites and industrial systems, and the challenge of those types of sites is that they're both sort of large in their geography, and they are also very kinetic and transformative in time. So as a way of sort of cataloging their structures and their form, we are sort of undertaking two representational types. A time-lapse, where the sort of media really in many ways is the sort of space between the two photographs. And what you sort of catalog is change over time, and then by cataloging just thousands and thousands of photographs of the same site, we can then recompose those in order to see the sort of transformation of systems.
And I think something that we find a lot on these industrial sites is that there's often really fixed physical structures, really simple physical structures that repeat in different sites. And so this is something of a catalog of those things which we reuse.
And then again, that comes back to the model, because what we're trying to sort of catalog here is this sort of remixing of industrial forms, intersecting the city, propagating the new forms, which are our designs, but that they all become part of like a consistent milieu that reconstructs this environment. Something like this type of infrastructure of highway, this has actually far less to do with Boston than it does to do with the entire state of Massachusetts trying to funnel into Boston on a day-to-day basis. So when you're designing here, you're not just designing within the context of the local vicinity of the people there, you're designing in the context, in fact, of like a national highway infrastructure system. And again, that kind of meeting is something that should be in our minds what cities are all about, is that cities are about that moment where global systems, national systems conflate with the people who live there and the local environment. And that becomes just such a sort of a dynamic palette of things to operate on, and actually something that can really reverberate through multiple systems so that a small action in one location can actually sort of scale up and magnify. And the idea that what's happening in Chile or what's happening in Mexico, what's happening in Australia is actually landing on the shores and shaping the shores of New York Harbor and Boston Harbor. Well, where do you as a designer situate yourself in that network? Because obviously situating yourself within only the mentality of the local sort of spot is sort of, I guess, ignoring 90% of the equation.
We see the line between industry and nature as something that's very indistinguishable and questionable, and we find with most of the sites we work with, they're always sites that have had some kind of past. Usually the ground plane itself is not something that can be taken for granted. It's usually constructed just as much as you'd expect. We find that in order to actually truly test any of our design interests, first we have to look very closely at what is already there. And there are certain embedded potentials within the landscape that through some kind of research often can kind of become the way to unlock new unexpected uses of these things. Nothing can really happen if you see it all as a whole. But if you start to kind of dissect the constituent parts and look at the variability that is latent, there starts to become opportunities for different types of things to be brought together.
Somehow in the evolutionary process of industries and landscapes, there's sort of some really hidden and embedded, very elegant details and wisdom as to why things are the way they are, because they have sort of come that way. And of course, there's all sorts of contradictions and frictions with that, but I think a lot of our work is always trying to boil different systems down. We're often sort of searching for that elegant detail, that sort of like an answer, something embedded in why the landscape is the way it is. So for us, in many ways, the design of industrial systems is really an effort to embed and sort of inject sort of fascinating urban moments back into the city in an environment where we're so eager to isolate things as a solution. How actually, when you intermix them aggressively, do you actually propagate something new?